Officer Marcus Chen had been patrolling the downtown district for 3 years, but he had never seen anything like what unfolded that cold Tuesday evening in November. The call came in at 9:47 p.m., a domestic disturbance at the Riverside Apartments, a rundown complex that housed mostly low-income families and transients. Marcus arrived at the scene within minutes. His patrol car's headlights cutting through the darkness, the building stood like a concrete giant against the night sky, with broken windows and graffiti covering its walls. He could hear shouting coming from the third floor, apartment 3B. As he climbed the narrow staircase, the smell of mold and cigarettes filled his nostrils. The door to 3B was slightly open. Marcus knocked firmly and announced himself. "Police, anyone home?" The shouting stopped immediately, replaced by an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. He pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. The apartment was a mess. Broken furniture scattered across the floor, holes punched in the drywall and glass from a shattered mirror reflecting his flashlight beam. Marcus called out again, moving deeper into the apartment. That's when he heard a woman crying from the bedroom. He found Sarah Martinez huddled in the corner, her face swollen and bruised. Blood trickled from her split lip. She looked up at Marcus with frightened eyes that had seen too much violence. "Where is he, Sarah?" Marcus asked gently, recognizing her from previous calls to this address. She pointed toward the fire escape window, which was wide open, cold November air rushing in. "He went out there when he heard your car," she whispered. "Please don't let him come back." Marcus radioed for backup and medical assistance, then moved toward the open window. The fire escape was old and rusty, groaning under the weight of anyone who used it. He could see wet footprints leading down the metal steps. Against his better judgment, he decided to pursue. The fire escape led down to a narrow alley behind the building. Marcus descended carefully, his service weapon drawn but pointed down. The alley was dark, lit only by a single flickering streetlight at the far end. Garbage cans lined one wall and the smell of rotting food mixed with the cold air. He heard movement ahead and called out, "Police! Come out with your hands visible!" A figure emerged from behind a dumpster. It was Tommy Martinez, Sarah's boyfriend, a man with a long history of domestic violence calls. Tommy was drunk, swaying on his feet, and in his right hand he held a broken beer bottle. "Stay back, cop." Tommy slurred his words, waving the jagged bottle. "This ain't your business." Marcus tried to calm the situation. "Put the bottle down, Tommy. Let's talk about this. Sarah's hurt and she needs medical attention. This doesn't have to get worse," but Tommy was beyond reasoning. The alcohol and rage had taken control. He lunged forward with surprising speed, the broken bottle aimed at Marcus's neck. The officer tried to step back, but his foot caught on a loose piece of concrete in the alley. Time seemed to slow down. Marcus felt himself falling backward, his arms windmilling as he tried to regain balance. Tommy was still coming forward, the bottle catching the light from the street lamp. Marcus managed to draw his weapon as he fell, but the angle was all wrong. The impact came from an unexpected direction. Instead of feeling the glass pierce his neck, Marcus felt a sharp, burning pain in his side as Tommy redirected his attack. The bottle found its mark between Marcus's ribs, just below his bulletproof vest. The jagged glass cut deep, and Marcus felt the warm wetness of blood spreading across his uniform. Tommy stood over him for a moment, breathing heavily, then dropped the bottle and ran. Marcus could hear his footsteps echoing off the alley walls as he disappeared into the night. The officer tried to sit up, but the pain was overwhelming. Each breath felt like fire, and he could taste copper in his mouth. He managed to key his radio with a shaking hand. "Officer down," he gasped. Stab wound to the torso. Suspect fled on foot. But as he tried to give his location, his vision began to blur. The radio slipped from his fingers and clattered on the concrete. Marcus knew he was in trouble. The wound was bleeding heavily, and he could feel his strength ebbing away with each heartbeat. He had basic first aid training, but this was beyond anything he could handle alone. He pressed his hands against the wound, trying to apply pressure, but blood seeped between his fingers. That's when he heard the footsteps approaching. Someone was coming down the alley, moving slowly and deliberately. Marcus tried to call out, but his voice was weak. Fear gripped him. What if Tommy had come back to finish what he started? A figure emerged from the shadows, but it wasn't Tommy. It was a man Marcus had seen around the neighborhood before, one of the homeless individuals who lived in the area. The man was thin and weathered, with graying hair and a scraggly beard. He wore layers of mismatched clothing and carried a worn backpack. Most people would have called 911 and waited for help to arrive. Most people would have been too afraid to get involved. But this man was different. He took one look at Marcus lying in the alley, blood pooling beneath him, and immediately dropped his backpack. "Easy there, officer," the man said in a calm, steady voice. "I'm going to help you." Marcus tried to speak, to tell the man to stay back, to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. The homeless man knelt beside him and gently moved Marcus's hands away from the wound. In the dim light, Marcus could see the man's eyes. They were clear and focused, not what he expected from someone living on the streets. "This is bad, but it's not hopeless," the man said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed out of place with his appearance. "I need you to stay calm and listen to me. Help is coming, but we need to keep you stable until they get here." The man opened his backpack and began pulling out items that Marcus couldn't quite see in the darkness. But there was something about the way the man moved, the confidence in his voice, that gave Marcus hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was going to survive this night. The homeless man's hands moved with practiced precision as he examined Marcus's wound. In the dim alley light, Marcus watched in amazement as the stranger pulled items from his backpack that no ordinary homeless person should possess. First came a small tactical flashlight, then what appeared to be medical supplies wrapped in clean plastic. "What's your name, officer?" the man asked as he shined the light on the wound. "Marcus," the officer managed to whisper through gritted teeth. "I'm David Walsh. And Marcus, I need you to focus on my voice and stay awake, understand? This wound hit your lower ribs, but I don't think it punctured anything vital. The bleeding looks worse than it is, but we still need to work fast." Marcus was confused. David spoke like a doctor, moved like a trained medic, but he was living on the streets. How did a homeless man know so much about treating wounds? And where did he get medical supplies? David tore open a package of gauze with his teeth, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of latex gloves. He snapped them on with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. "I'm going to apply direct pressure now. It's going to hurt, but I need to control this bleeding." The pain shot through Marcus's body as David pressed a thick pad of gauze against the wound, but along with the pain came relief. Someone who knew what they were doing was helping him. The bleeding began to slow almost immediately. "Good," David muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. "Entry wound is clean. No major arterial involvement. We can work with this." Marcus tried to understand what was happening. Where did you learn?" "Shh, save your strength," David interrupted. "I need to check for an exit wound." He carefully rolled Marcus onto his side, supporting his head and neck with surprising gentleness. "No exit wound. The glass is still in there, which is actually good news. It's acting like a plug." David reached back into his pack and pulled out what looked like an emergency medical kit, the kind used by paramedics or military personnel. He opened it to reveal IV bags, medical tape, antiseptic, and other supplies that definitely weren't available at any local store. "Where did you get all this stuff?" Marcus asked weakly. David paused for just a moment, and Marcus caught something in his eyes, a flash of memory, perhaps pain. "Let's just say I used to be in a line of work where knowing how to patch people up was important." Working quickly, David cleaned around the wound with antiseptic, causing Marcus to gasp. "Sorry, but infection will kill you faster than blood loss if we don't do this right." He applied a pressure bandage with military precision, securing it with medical tape in a pattern that looked professional. "I need to start an IV," David said, already preparing the equipment. "You're going into shock, and we need to get some fluids into you before the paramedics arrive." Marcus watched in disbelief as David found a vein in his arm on the first try and inserted the IV needle with the skill of an experienced medic. Within seconds, saline solution was flowing into his bloodstream. The relief was almost immediate. "How long have you been living on the streets?" Marcus asked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. David's hands never stopped moving as he checked Marcus's pulse and blood pressure using a small device from his kit. "About 2 years now, but that's not important right now. What's important is keeping you stable." The sound of sirens began to echo through the alley, growing louder by the second. David looked relieved. "Cavalry's coming. Your vitals are stabilizing and the bleeding has stopped. You're going to make it, Marcus." As the paramedics rushed into the alley with their equipment and bright lights, Marcus saw them stop and look at the scene in surprise. David had positioned Marcus in the recovery position, established IV access, controlled the bleeding, and was monitoring his vital signs. It was textbook emergency medicine. Who worked on him? Asked the lead paramedic, a woman named Janet, who Marcus recognized from previous calls. I did, David said simply, standing up and stepping back. Penetrating wound to the lower right torso. No exit wound, foreign object still in place. Bleeding controlled, IV established, vitals stable. Janet and her partner exchanged glances. The homeless man was using proper medical terminology and had performed emergency treatment that would have impressed a hospital trauma team. Are you a doctor? Janet asked as her team took over Marcus's care. David shook his head. Not exactly. He began packing his supplies back into his backpack. Just someone who used to know how to do this. The paramedics worked quickly to prepare Marcus for transport. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Marcus reached out and grabbed David's sleeve. Wait, he said. I want to thank you. You saved my life. David looked down at him with sad eyes. Just doing what anyone should do, officer. Take care of yourself. Will you be here when I get out of the hospital? Marcus asked. I'd like to talk to you, David hesitated. I don't usually stay in one place very long. Please, Marcus insisted. I owe you my life. The least I can do is buy you a meal and hear your story. Your story might not be one you want to hear, David said quietly. As the paramedics wheeled Marcus toward the ambulance, he called back, Everyone has a story worth hearing. David stood in the alley, watching the ambulance drive away with its lights flashing. He looked down at his hands, still stained with Marcus's blood despite the gloves he had worn. For a moment, memories threatened to overwhelm him. Other times, other places, other wounded men he had tried to save. He shouldered his backpack and began walking deeper into the alley, away from the police cars that were now arriving at the scene. Detective Lisa Park climbed out of an unmarked car and began talking to the paramedics, taking notes about what had happened. The homeless guy who helped him, Janet was saying, he knew what he was doing. Professional-level medical training. Probably saved the officer's life. Detective Park looked around the alley. Where is he now? He left, Janet replied. Said his name was David Walsh. Older guy, probably in his 50s, thin gray hair. Been living rough for a while by the look of him. Detective Park made a note. Something about this didn't add up. Homeless people didn't usually carry professional medical equipment or have the training to perform emergency trauma care. There was more to David Walsh's story, and she was determined to find out what it was. Meanwhile, Marcus was rushed to City General Hospital, where Dr. Sarah Kim was waiting in the trauma bay. As the paramedics gave their report, she was impressed by the quality of the pre-hospital care. Whoever treated him in the field knew exactly what they were doing, she told her team. Clean pressure bandage, proper IV placement, good patient positioning. This homeless guy probably saved this officer's life tonight. 3 days later, Marcus woke up in his hospital bed with a clearer mind than he'd had since the attack. The pain medication was finally wearing off enough for him to think straight. His ribs ached and moving was still difficult, but Dr. Kim had told him he was healing well. The glass had missed his vital organs by inches. Detective Park sat in the chair beside his bed holding a notepad. She had been waiting for him to be alert enough to give a proper statement about what happened in the alley. The paramedics said a homeless man treated you before they arrived, Detective Park said. Can you tell me about that? Marcus shifted carefully in his bed, trying to find a comfortable position. His name was David Walsh. Lisa, I've never seen anything like it. This guy had medical equipment in his backpack, knew exactly what to do. He probably saved my life. What kind of equipment? IV supplies, gauze, antiseptic, a blood pressure cuff. Professional stuff. And he moved like he'd done trauma medicine before many times. He wasn't just some guy who took a first aid class. Detective Park made notes. We've been asking around the neighborhood about him. Several people know David Walsh by sight, but nobody knows much about his background. He's been living in the area for about 2 years, keeps to himself mostly. Sleeps in different places, sometimes the old warehouse on 5th Street, sometimes under the bridge. Marcus felt frustrated. There has to be more to his story. People don't just learn that level of medical training by accident. Has anyone checked military records? That's what I'm thinking too, Detective Park agreed. The way the paramedics described his technique, it sounds like combat medic training. I've put in a request to check Department of Defense records for a David Walsh, but it might take a few days. That afternoon, Marcus's partner, Officer Jenny Rodriguez, came to visit. She brought flowers and updates from the precinct. Everyone's talking about your homeless hero, she said, arranging the flowers on his bedside table. Captain Williams wants to find this David guy and give him some kind of commendation. Any luck tracking him down? Jenny shook her head. It's like he disappeared. We've checked all his usual spots, asked around, put the word out that we just want to thank him. Nothing. Marcus stared out the hospital window at the city below. Somewhere out there, David Walsh was living on the streets, carrying medical equipment and secrets that might explain how he had saved a police officer's life with such professional skill. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, David sat on a bench in Riverside Park, staring at the sunset. His backpack was beside him, the same one that had contained the supplies that saved Marcus's life. Inside, carefully organized and clean, were items that told the story of his past, items he couldn't bring himself to throw away. A young woman approached the bench. Her name was Maria Santos, and she worked for a local homeless outreach program. She had been trying to help David for months, but he always politely declined assistance. "Mind if I sit down, David?" she asked. He gestured to the empty space on the bench. Maria was one of the few people who had shown him genuine kindness without asking for anything in return. "I heard about what you did for that police officer," Maria said gently. "People are talking about it. They say you saved his life." David was quiet for a long moment. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "With the right skills," Maria added. "That wasn't luck, David, that was training." David looked at her with tired eyes. "Sometimes I wish I could forget everything I know." "Why?" "Because remembering hurts too much." Maria had worked with enough veterans to recognize the signs. The way David carried himself, his alertness to his surroundings, the nightmares she suspected he had. It all pointed to military service and trauma. "You served, didn't you?" she asked softly. David nodded slowly. "Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. I was a 68W, combat medic." The pieces began to fall into place for Maria. "What happened when you came back?" David's hands clenched into fists. "I tried to readjust. Got a job at a hospital, worked in the emergency department. For a while it was good. I was helping people again, using my skills for something positive. But the memories, they never went away." He paused, looking up at the darkening sky. "One night we had a trauma come in. Young soldier ID blast, multiple injuries. As soon as I saw him, I was back there. Back in the field, hearing the mortars, smelling the smoke. I had a panic attack right there in the trauma bay. Couldn't function." Maria listened without judgment, the way she had been trained to do. "After that it got worse," David continued. "More flashbacks, more panic attacks. I tried therapy, medication, everything the VA offered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone I tried to save was still dying. All the soldiers I worked on in the field, all the ones I couldn't save, they haunted me." "So you left?" "I lost my job at the hospital after another episode. My wife tried to be supportive, but I was drinking too much, not sleeping, angry all the time. She finally left, took our daughter with her. Said she couldn't watch me destroy myself anymore." David reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed him in military uniform standing next to a woman and a little girl. He looked younger, healthier, hopeful. "That was taken right before my last deployment," he said. "Look at that guy. He thought he was going to come home and everything would be the same. What happened to your family?" "They moved across the country. Sarah remarried a good man who can give them the stability I couldn't. My daughter Emma is 12 now. She probably doesn't even remember me." Maria felt her heart breaking for this man who had given so much in service to his country, only to lose everything when he came home. "David, there are programs that can help. Veterans housing, counseling, job training," and David shook his head. "I tried all that. The system failed me once. I can't trust it again. At least out here, I'm not hurting anyone. But you're hurting yourself. Better me than them." They sat in silence as darkness fell over the park. Finally, Maria spoke again. "That police officer you saved, he's been asking about you. He wants to thank you properly. He doesn't owe me anything, maybe not. But maybe you owe it to yourself to let someone be grateful. Maybe you owe it to yourself to remember that you're still a hero, even if you don't feel like one." David looked at the photograph again, then carefully put it back in his backpack. "Heroes don't end up living under bridges, Maria. Heroes sometimes fall down," she replied. "But they're still heroes." As Maria left the park, David remained on the bench thinking about Marcus Chen and the night in the alley. For a few minutes, when he was treating the wounded officer, the old David had emerged, the medic who saved lives, who made a difference. It had felt good to be useful again, to use his skills for something positive instead of just trying to survive another day on the streets. David's memories of that night in the alley were crystal clear, burned into his mind with the same intensity as his memories from Afghanistan. He had been walking back to his usual sleeping spot under the 4th Street Bridge when he heard the commotion from the apartment building. Living on the streets had taught him to avoid trouble, but something made him pause in the shadows to watch. He saw the police car arrive, watched Officer Chen climb the fire escape, heard the shouting in the alley. When Tommy Martinez ran past his hiding spot with the broken bottle still in his hand, David knew something bad had happened. Against every instinct that told him to stay hidden, he had moved toward the alley. The sight of Marcus lying there bleeding brought back a flood of memories. Suddenly, David wasn't in a downtown alley anymore. He was back in Kandahar province, kneeling beside PFC Rodriguez after the roadside bomb. He was in Fallujah, working frantically to save Sergeant Thompson after the sniper attack. He was in a dozen different places where young soldiers had bled out while he fought to keep them alive. But this time was different. This time he had the right equipment. This time he wasn't under enemy fire. This time, he might actually be able to save someone. David had been carrying the medical supplies for almost 2 years, ever since he left his last attempt at normal life. He told himself it was just practical. Living on the streets was dangerous and medical care wasn't always available. But deep down, he knew he carried them because being a medic was the only identity he had left. When he knelt beside Marcus and saw the wound, his training took over completely. The officer was conscious but going into shock. The bleeding was significant but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. David had seen much worse in the field. "Easy there, officer," he had said, automatically slipping into the calm, authoritative voice he had used to reassure wounded soldiers. "I'm going to help you." As he worked, David found himself talking to Marcus the same way he had talked to the soldiers he treated overseas. "Stay with me now. You're going to be fine. I've got you." The familiar routine was both comforting and heartbreaking. When he applied pressure to the wound, David remembered Corporal Williams, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio who had taken shrapnel to the chest. David had managed to keep him alive long enough for the medevac helicopter, but Williams had died during surgery at the field hospital. For months afterward, David wondered if he had done something wrong, if he could have saved him. Starting the IV brought back memories of Lance Corporal Garcia, who had lost so much blood from a leg wound that David had to start 3 different IVs before finding a viable vein. Garcia had survived and was medically retired with full benefits. He still sent David Christmas cards. Every technique David used to save Marcus had been learned in the worst possible circumstances, practiced on young men and women who were fighting for their lives thousands of miles from home. Some had lived, some had died, but David had never stopped trying to save them all. As the paramedics approached, David felt the familiar surge of relief and anxiety that came with transferring a patient to higher care. In the field, this was always the moment when he learned whether his work had been enough. Would the patient make it to surgery? Would they survive long enough to go home? Back in the present, 5 days after the incident, Detective Park finally received the military records she had requested. She sat in her office reading through David Walsh's service record, and with each page, her respect for the homeless man grew. David Walsh had enlisted in the Army at 18, fresh out of high school in a small town in Montana. He had completed basic training and then advanced individual training as a combat medic. His first deployment to Afghanistan came when he was just 20 years old. His service record was impressive. David had received 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and an Army Commendation Medal. His commanding officers consistently rated him as an exceptional medic who went above and beyond to care for wounded soldiers. One report noted that he had saved an estimated 43 lives during his 3 deployments. The records also told a darker story. David had been diagnosed with PTSD after his 2nd deployment, but had requested to return to active duty. During his 3rd deployment, he had been wounded by an IED blast that killed 2 soldiers he was treating. The psychological evaluation after that incident recommended immediate medical retirement. Detective Park found David's discharge papers, dated just over 4 years ago. He had been honorably discharged with full disability benefits for PTSD and a traumatic brain injury. According to the records, he had been receiving treatment at a VA hospital in Denver before losing contact with the system 2 years ago. She picked up her phone and called Marcus at the hospital. "I found him," she said when he answered. I found his military record. Marcus, this guy is a legitimate war hero." Marcus listened as she read through David's service record. No wonder he knew what he was doing. "Lisa, we have to find him. Someone like that shouldn't be living on the streets." "I've been trying. I've contacted every shelter, every outreach program, every place where homeless veterans might go for help. It's like he doesn't want to be found." After Detective Park hung up, Marcus lay in his hospital bed thinking about David Walsh. Here was a man who had saved dozens of lives in combat, who had been wounded in service to his country, and who was now living homeless on the streets. The system that David had served with such distinction had somehow failed him completely. Marcus made a decision. As soon as he was released from the hospital, he was going to find David Walsh, not just to thank him, but to help him get back on his feet. It was the least he could do for the man who had saved his life. Meanwhile, David sat in an abandoned parking garage where he sometimes spent cold nights. The concrete walls provided some protection from the wind, and there were enough shadows to hide from anyone who might cause trouble. He had been having nightmares since the night he helped Marcus, not his usual war dreams, but new ones where he failed to save the officer, where his skills weren't enough, where Marcus died in the alley. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 2 years he had been tormented by memories of the soldiers he couldn't save. Now he was having nightmares about someone he had actually managed to help. It seemed like his mind was determined to find new ways to torture him. He pulled out the photograph of his family again, studying the faces of his wife and daughter. Sarah had remarried last year, according to the Christmas card that had somehow found its way to him through a chain of VA contacts. Emma was doing well in school, playing soccer, learning piano. They were happy without him. David carefully put the photograph away and checked his medical supplies. He had used some of them to help Marcus, and he needed to restock. Tomorrow he would visit the free clinic and see if he could get some new gauze and antiseptic. He told himself it was just being practical, but he knew the truth. He kept the supplies because being ready to help someone was the only thing that made him feel human anymore. Marcus was released from the hospital on a Friday morning, 6 days after the attack. Dr. Kim gave him strict instructions about rest and recovery, but Marcus had other plans. As soon as his partner Jenny picked him up, he asked her to drive him to the downtown area where David Walsh was known to stay. "Marcus, you should be going home to rest," Jenny protested as she helped him into the passenger seat of her patrol car. "The doctor said you need at least 2 weeks before returning to duty." "I'm not going back to duty yet," Marcus replied, wincing as the seatbelt pressed against his bandaged ribs. "I'm going to find the man who saved my life." They spent the morning visiting every location where homeless individuals gathered. The old warehouse on 5th Street was empty except for some scattered belongings and makeshift shelters. The area under the 4th Street Bridge showed signs of recent habitation, but no David. They checked the park where he sometimes sat, the loading dock behind the grocery store where he occasionally found day work, and the alley behind the diner where the owner sometimes gave away leftover food. At each location, Marcus talked to other homeless individuals, showing them the photograph from David's military record that Detective Park had obtained. Most people recognized him but hadn't seen him in several days. "He keeps to himself mostly," said an older woman named Rose who lived in a tent city behind the train station. "Nice enough guy, but you can tell he's carrying some heavy stuff. Sometimes I hear him talking in his sleep, calling out names, soldier names, you know." Marcus felt his determination growing stronger. This war hero shouldn't be suffering alone on the streets. Their break came that afternoon when they met Maria Santos from the Homeless Outreach Program. She was distributing sandwiches and information about social services when Marcus approached her. "I'm looking for David Walsh," Marcus said, showing his badge. "I'm the police officer he helped earlier this week." Maria's eyes widened with recognition. "You're the one he saved. How are you feeling?" "Better, thanks to him. Do you know where I can find David?" Maria hesitated. "He doesn't like attention, and he's been even more withdrawn since that night. I think helping you brought up some difficult memories for him." "Please," Marcus said. "I need to thank him properly. and maybe I can help him get connected with some services. He's tried the services before, Maria said sadly. The system failed him, but she seemed to make a decision. There's a place he goes sometimes when he's having a particularly bad day. There's an old church on Elm Street that was damaged in a fire last year. It's been abandoned, but David sometimes sits in what used to be the sanctuary. I think he finds some peace there. 20 minutes later, Marcus and Jenny stood outside the fire-damaged St. Mark's Episcopal Church. Half the roof was gone and the walls were blackened with smoke damage, but the basic structure remained intact. They found David sitting in what had once been a pew, staring at the space where the altar used to be. He looked up when he heard their footsteps, and Marcus saw a mix of emotions cross his face: surprise, concern, and something that might have been fear. "Officer Chen," David said, standing up, "you shouldn't be out of the hospital yet. How are you feeling?" "I'm alive because of you," Marcus replied. "That's how I'm feeling." David looked uncomfortable. Any medic would have done the same thing. "But not any medic was there," Marcus said. "You were. And I've learned about your service record, David. 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart. You saved 43 lives in combat." David's face darkened. "You had no right to look into my background." "I had every right to learn about the man who saved my life," Marcus said firmly. "David, you're a hero. You shouldn't be living like this." "Heroes don't end up homeless," David said bitterly. "Heroes don't lose their families, their jobs, their minds." Marcus moved closer, careful not to aggravate his injury. "You haven't lost your mind, David. You're dealing with trauma from serving your country with distinction. There's no shame in that, isn't there?" David's voice rose slightly. "Do you know what I was doing the night I found you? I was walking back to my sleeping spot under a bridge, carrying everything I own in a backpack. I haven't had a real conversation with another human being in weeks. I have nightmares every night about soldiers I couldn't save, and now I'm having nightmares about almost not being able to save you." Marcus felt his heart breaking for this man. "David, let me help you. Let me connect you with VA services, with housing programs, with counselors who understand what you've been through." "I tried all that," David said. "The VA system is overwhelmed. I spent months on waiting lists and group therapy sessions with people who didn't understand combat trauma, taking medications that made me feel like a zombie. When I finally got housing assistance, they put me in a studio apartment next to a construction site. The noise from the machinery triggered flashbacks so severe that I ended up in the emergency room." He sat back down heavily on the broken pew. "The caseworker told me I was being difficult, that I needed to learn to adjust." "Adjust to what?" "To feeling like I was back in a war zone every morning when the construction started? To taking pills that made me feel nothing at all?" Jenny had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "My brother is a Marine veteran. He went through similar struggles after he got back from deployment. It took time, but he found help." "Good for him," David said without bitterness. "Some of us aren't that lucky." Marcus sat down beside David on the damaged pew, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "What if it wasn't about the system this time? What if it was about individuals who want to help?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if instead of going through bureaucratic channels, we found you housing privately? What if instead of VA counselors, we found you a therapist who specializes in combat trauma? What if we approached this differently?" David looked at him skeptically. "Why would you do that?" "Because you saved my life and because it's the right thing to do. Because a man who served his country with honor shouldn't be sleeping under bridges." For a long moment, David was quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I haven't been anyone's priority in a very long time." "Well, you're my priority now," Marcus said. "And I'm not giving up on you." David pulled out the worn photograph of his family. "I had everything once. A wife who loved me, a daughter who thought I was Superman, a career where I helped people. I threw it all away." "You didn't throw it away," Marcus said gently. "You got sick and you didn't get the help you needed. That's not your fault. Sarah tried to help me. She really did. But I was drinking, having panic attacks, couldn't hold down a job. I was angry all the time, at her, at Emma, at myself. One night I had a flashback and threw a plate across the kitchen. Emma was there and she started crying. The look of fear in her eyes." David's voice broke. "I realized I had become the kind of man I used to protect people from." Marcus felt tears in his own eyes. "You recognized the problem and removed yourself from the situation. That took strength." "It took cowardice," David corrected. "A stronger man would have fought harder to get better." A stronger man wouldn't have survived 3 combat deployments and saved 43 lives, Marcus said. David, what you're dealing with isn't weakness. It's a wound just like the one you treated in the alley, and wounds can heal if they're cared for properly. David looked at the photograph again, then at Marcus. What if I can't be fixed? What if I try again and I just fail again? Then we'll figure out another way, Marcus said. But I'm not walking away from this. You didn't walk away from me when I was bleeding in that alley, and I'm not walking away from you now. 6 months later, Marcus Chen stood in the kitchen of a small but clean apartment watching David Walsh prepare breakfast. The apartment was sparse but comfortable, a 1-bedroom unit in a quiet complex away from busy streets and construction sites. David moved with more confidence now, though Marcus could still see traces of the haunted man he had first encountered in that burned-out church. Coffee? David asked, holding up the pot. Please, Marcus replied, settling carefully into one of the kitchen chairs. His ribs had healed completely, but cold morning still reminded him of that night in the alley. David poured 2 cups and sat across from him. How's the physical therapy going? Good. Dr. Kim says I should be cleared for full duty next month. Marcus sipped his coffee. How's the new job? A small smile crossed David's face. Better than I expected. Teaching first aid to emergency responders isn't exactly what I thought I'd be doing with my life, but it feels good to be useful again. The job had come through an unexpected connection. Dr. Sarah Kim, the trauma surgeon who had treated Marcus, had been looking for someone to help train paramedics and EMTs in advanced trauma care. When Marcus told her about David's background and skills, she had been immediately interested. Combat medics see trauma that most civilian medics never encounter, Dr. Kim had explained when she offered David the position. Your experience could help save lives here at home. It hadn't been an easy transition. David's first few weeks at the hospital had been difficult, with panic attacks triggered by the sounds and smells of the emergency department. But Dr. Kim had been patient, adjusting his schedule and responsibilities until he found his comfort zone in the training center. I got a call from Maria yesterday, David said, referring to the social worker who had helped coordinate his transition off the streets. She said the new trauma kits you helped design are being distributed to all the homeless outreach teams. Marcus nodded. It had been David's idea to create specialized medical kits for social workers who encountered homeless individuals in crisis. His experience living on the streets combined with his medical training had made him uniquely qualified to identify what supplies would be most useful. Any word from Colorado? Marcus asked gently. David's expression grew complicated. Sarah called last week. Emma wants to see me. This was the conversation Marcus had been both hoping for and dreading. David's ex-wife had been following his progress from a distance, receiving updates through the VA counselor, who had been working with David for the past 4 months. Unlike his previous experiences with VA services, this counselor, Dr. James Martinez, was a combat veteran himself who understood the specific challenges of readjusting to civilian life. How do you feel about that? Terrified, David admitted. She's 14 now, Marcus. She was just a little girl when I left. What if she doesn't want anything to do with me? What if seeing me brings back bad memories? What if it brings back good ones? Marcus countered. You were her father for 10 years before your deployments. That has to count for something. David pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a recent photo that Sarah had sent. Emma was tall for her age, with David's dark eyes and her mother's smile. She was wearing a soccer uniform and holding a trophy. She made varsity as a freshman, David said with obvious pride. Sarah says she wants to study medicine, maybe become a doctor. I wonder where she got that interest in helping people, Marcus said with a smile. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence. It was a far cry from the desperate conversation they'd had in the abandoned church 6 months ago. Since then, David had not only found stable housing and employment, but had also begun the slow process of rebuilding his life. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been setbacks, nights when the nightmares returned with crushing intensity, days when David struggled to get out of bed, moments when he nearly gave up and returned to the streets. But Marcus had kept his promise. Whenever David called, Marcus was there, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to help him through a crisis. I need to ask you something, David said suddenly, and I want you to be honest with me. Always. Do you ever regret getting involved? I mean, really think about it. 6 months ago, I was just some homeless guy who happened to know first aid. You could have said thank you and moved on with your life. Instead, you've spent half a year helping someone you barely knew get back on his feet. Do you ever wonder if it was worth it? Marcus considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had indeed been challenging. He had spent countless hours on the phone with social workers, therapists, and housing coordinators. He had used his own savings to help cover David's security deposit and first month's rent. He had attended therapy sessions when David asked for moral support, and had been awakened by middle-of-the-night phone calls during David's worst moments. "David," Marcus said finally, "6 months ago you saved my life with skills you learned serving your country. Skills you developed helping wounded soldiers in the worst possible conditions. The fact that you ended up homeless doesn't diminish what you sacrificed for this country, or the lives you saved, or the value you have as a human being." He leaned forward. "So no, I don't regret getting involved. I regret that it took someone getting stabbed in an alley for our paths to cross. I regret that you suffered alone for 2 years before that night. But I don't regret anything we've done since then." David's eyes filled with tears. "I used to think about killing myself, you know. Not actively planning it, but thinking about how much easier it would be for everyone if I just disappeared. Since that night in the alley, since you refused to let me disappear, I haven't had those thoughts once." "Good," Marcus said firmly, "because the world is better with you in it." Later that morning, Marcus drove David to his weekly appointment with Dr. Martinez. As they sat in the waiting room, David seemed nervous. "What if Emma doesn't want to see me when it comes down to it?" he asked. "Then you'll respect her decision and hope that changes as she gets older," Marcus replied. "But from what Sarah has told you, it sounds like Emma has been asking about you for months." Dr. Martinez called David into his office and Marcus settled in to wait. During their first meeting, the therapist had explained that David's recovery would be a long process, possibly lifelong. PTSD didn't just go away, but it could be managed with the right combination of therapy, medication, and social support. An hour later, David emerged from the session looking lighter somehow. "Dr. Martinez thinks I'm ready," he said. "Ready for what?" "To call Emma. To have an actual conversation with my daughter for the first time in 2 years." Marcus felt a surge of hope and pride for his friend. "When?" Sarah suggested. "This weekend. She's going to be there for the call, to make sure Emma feels safe and supported." As they walked to the car, Marcus thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A domestic violence call, a broken bottle, a chance encounter in an alley, and 2 men whose lives had been forever changed by a few minutes of crisis and compassion. "Marcus," David said as they reached the car, "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Thank you, not just for saving my life, but for giving me my life back. You saved yourself. David, I just refused to let you give up." That evening, Marcus returned to his own apartment and called his sergeant to schedule his return to active duty. As he prepared for bed, he thought about the difference 6 months could make in a person's life. David Walsh was no longer the broken, homeless veteran he had encountered in that church. He was a man rebuilding his life, contributing to his community, and preparing to reconnect with his daughter. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David. "Made the call. Talked to Emma for an hour. She wants to visit next month. Thank you for believing in second chances." Marcus smiled as he typed back, "Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like." Outside his window, the city continued its nightly rhythm. Somewhere out there, other people were struggling with their own battles, their own traumas, their own moments of despair. But tonight, at least 2 lives had been changed for the better, because a police officer and a combat veteran had crossed paths in an alley, and because both men had chosen compassion over indifference. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Sometimes it was about refusing to walk away from someone who needed help, even when it would be easier to look the other way. Sometimes it was about seeing the person inside the circumstances and believing that everyone deserved a chance to heal. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus thought about the lesson David had taught him that night in the alley. That the most important equipment a person could carry wasn't medical supplies or weapons or protective gear. It was the willingness to help a stranger, the courage to use whatever skills you possessed in service of another human being, and the determination to never stop trying to save lives, no matter how broken your own life might seem.